And welcome back. It is the first segment of the morning, and it's going to be a conversation, as we mentioned prior to the commercial break, a discussion on the impact of gill nets. That being said, we have with us here a representative of the environmental community as an environmentalist, Mike Hushner of the Belize River Lodge. Good morning. We also have with us Andrew Rowe from the Belize Game Fish Association.
Morning, guys.
And you also sit on the gill net task force, correct?
Yes.
Good morning once again.
Morning.
Gentlemen.
Morning.
Yes. All right. So it seems that we are making progress on the issue of looking at the use of gill nets in Belize. And I want to start off really just setting the basic backdrop for our viewers, because for people who are not involved in fishing, we have no idea what the difference is between any of the nets or any of the equipment used. So let's take that opportunity first, Andrew, to talk about what a gill net is and what are the concerns about it.
So a gill net is, you've probably seen a cast net or a fishing net. I think much like what this gentleman here is throwing on the screen, and this is it's made up of similar material, monofilament. And but it's very different.
Yeah, that's not a gill net.
That is not
very
a gill
clear.
net. Yeah. So gill nets are they can be anywhere from maybe 50 feet to 100 feet, all the way up to 300 yards, 400 yards. Very, very long pieces of net. They have varying mesh sizes, so the holes in the net can be 4 inches right down to barely anything. You know, the size of a dollar coin. And the concept is that you take the net and you find an area where it tends to be that fish are congregating. Usually they're schooling for a purpose. They're there to reproduce most of the time. And you then take that piece of net and you spread it across this area that you've decided to fish. And what happens is the fish swim into it and they get entangled. And so you leave the net there for a period of time. Most fishermen will leave it overnight because you have a higher success of catching fish. The fish can't see it. They swim into it. And in the morning you come, you roll that net up and you take the fish out of it.
Yeah.
And the issue arises that, fine, gill nets are a very efficient way, you can say, of catching fish, because whatever swims into it is caught. But when you look at it from the other point of view, you have very important fish species to the country and that are protected. You have the tarpon, you have bonefish and permit. These are considered sports fish, and the government has decided several years ago that we are going to protect these and they will not be killed because they have much higher value to the sports fishing industry, to the economy on a whole, being alive, that you can take tourists out there and you can catch them. So you have those fish that get caught up in the net. Sharks as well get caught up in the net, which are also very important to the ecosystem. And then you also get things like manatees, sea turtles, any swimming animal, anything that swims into it will get caught and eventually will die if it's not taken care of quick enough. So it has a they call it, Mr. Mike always refers to them as
walls of death.
The walls of death, because basically whatever comes in contact with it is dead. So the use of this type of fishing equipment is very destructive to the marine environment on a whole, to the fish, to the mammals, to the reptiles, to everything. Across the world, most developed countries where there is a developed fishing industry have decided, you know, this is not type of equipment that we want to have in our waters. And so this conversation, and Mr. Mike's been involved in this conversation, I think, since I was a kid. This has been going on for decades now. And it feels as though we are now at the precipice of seeing some sort of change, where the government has decided that they're going to implement a gill net task force. And the intention of the task force is to analyze all sides of the argument, gather as much data as possible, present what the task force believes the right position should be, and then Cabinet will make a decision on how they would like to proceed with handling gill nets, if it stays the same as it is now, or if there's a change in regulation on them.
That's a key point to look at. There have been some measures put in place to kind of regulate the use of gill nets, where perhaps any fisherman could have used it before. There are now very strict rules. It has to be registered and several other things. Talk about what's currently in place to try to minimize the impact of gill nets.
So at the moment, there's regulation on the mesh size. Again, the mesh size is the size of the hole that goes into the net. The size of the hole in the regulation is 4 inches, which is probably something about that, maybe a little bigger. Now, you guys have been to the fish market before, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how many fish you see at the fish market can swim through a hole that big?
Yeah.
It's not very many.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the issues. There's length. I think it can be no bigger than 100 yards. There's depth. It can't be, I think it's 4 feet. It can't be deeper than 4 feet. There's regulation on where they can and cannot be set. So they can't be set. Let me rephrase. They should not be set in the mouths of rivers, in estuaries, I think within 2 miles of any populated area. These are
Or in
all
marine reserve.
in marine reserve,
Yeah.
right? And they're also to be licensed. So any gill net fisherman needs to go take their net. They need to get licensed, and then a tag is given to them by the fisheries department, and then that's put on the net so that we know that they're licensed. Now, in theory, you know, these are fairly strict regulations, but just like any law, unless they're enforced, they're not really laws. They're
Yeah.
just guidelines that people should be operating under.
Yeah.
And at the moment, there is virtually no enforcement done on gill netting. And from the experience, if you're a boater and you're boating anytime in the evening, you're probably going to see a gill net. And in the experience of myself, members, and other people who work with gill nets, they're very rarely, if ever, set anywhere that the law stipulates, because those aren't places that the fish congregate the most.
Yeah.
If you can spread a net across, if you have a river mouth that's 100 yards wide, and you can spread a net across that river mouth, essentially anything that's coming down out of that river is yours. You catch it, everything.
Yeah.
So it's not selective. So you have that, and very few are tagged. So I think there's just a little over 100 licensed gill net fishermen in the country, but that certainly does not reflect the actual usage of gill nets around the country.
Yeah.
Now that has come with its own counter argument, if I may. I believe last Tuesday, I did an interview with a representative of the Belize Shark Fishers Association. And this is one of those groups that has raised an objection to the use of gill nets, or the proposed doing away with the banning of the gill net usage, to say that, well, one, it's not as bad as it's made out to be. I guess that was part of the argument that was being put forward, that it's not as bad as it's being described. And secondly, where it relates to sharks and being able to catch sharks and what have you, there are other groups in southern Belize that are using gill nets, and the impact of it is not as devastating as it is being described elsewhere by other proponents of banning or prohibiting this kind of gear. As someone on the task force, from an objective point of view, do you believe that if they are to be told you cannot any longer use gill nets, that another viable option should be presented for them to sustain their livelihoods? Because that's the other thing. They're saying, well, look, my way of life is immediately threatened, directly threatened, by you telling me I can no longer employ this particular method of fishing. Your response?
Yeah, it's, you know, like I said, the purpose of the task force is to listen to all sides of the conversation. We can't just say, because one entity says, I don't like this thing, then we're going to move towards a ban. There's not only, you raise the shark fishermen, but who do, their livelihoods do depend to some extent on the use of gill net. I know that they use quite a few other conventional means of fishing as well, but you have to expand that further, because there are a number of fishing communities around the country that do, to some extent, depend on the use of gill nets. Now, very few fishermen use gill nets exclusively. I don't think there's any fisherman across the country that uses gill nets exclusively if they are real commercial fishermen and their livelihoods depend on gill netting or depend on fishing. So both sides of the argument have to be looked at. In every case, no matter what type of fishing you're doing, there is an alternative.
Yeah.
And that alternative needs to be looked at to make sure that it's viable.
Yeah.
And if it is viable, we need to figure out how do we make sure that it remains viable.
Yeah.
The use, coming back to gill nets, you know, it's yes, it may be something that supports you today, but if every fisherman across the country used the gill net, even if we continue to use gill nets in the way that we are using them now, we will not have a viable fishery in the coming probably in the coming decade. I mean, it's already been, Mr. Mike, I'm sure I think should give you some experience on what he has seen in his lifetime.
Yeah.
And we've gone from a fishery that was thriving when he built his lodge quite some time ago. This was the place to come fishing because the amount of fish was next to none. Yeah. And we've now gone down the road where he struggles to get clients or his long time, people who have been fishing with you for 15, 20 years have said, you know what, I don't see it anymore. I don't remember what this was like.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an interesting segue to get him involved
Yeah.
in the conversation.
Well, Andrew has very clearly explained the gillnet problems and so on. A few weeks ago, I was asked to make a presentation at the Fishermen's Association meeting. And they sent me the minister was supposed to be there, but at the last minute couldn't make it, so they asked me to substitute. I said, me for the minister? Anyway, they sent me a proposed speech, and I used the first 2 paragraphs for the introduction. One of the things I mentioned to them is that you as fishermen and through the cooperatives for many years have exported scalefish to the USA. It was a viable business for many people, members of the cooperative, thrived on that. Some do lobster, some do conch, some do scalefish, some do all 3, depending on the time of year. But all of a sudden now, we're not getting enough scalefish to export. We're not even getting enough scalefish for the local market, including the local tourism market. So now we're importing fish fillet. Yeah. You realize we're importing catfish? It's called bassa.
Unfortunately, Andrew schooled us about that in a previous conversation.
Well,
and now I'm very selective about fish.
I grew up on Cullet Canal, and there was a latrine or outhouse just a few feet away from the corner of our fence. And I could see the catfish in action. So after that, even cattle that was farmed in New Orleans fish ponds, I had a difficulty even tasting it.
Because of the mental,
So the point I'm trying to make is that we've lost the ability to produce enough fish for the local market.
Yeah.
So now we're importing cattle or catfish called bassa from Indonesia, Indochina area, where they're farmed over there, shipped to Mexico and brought into Belize. I don't know what the regulations are, the customs and so on, but you go to some of the supermarkets and you see bass fish. And what's a bass fish? It's probably the catfish. No, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good fish. It's probably good and healthy, maybe even healthier than wild fish. But few Belizeans realize that when they buy that now, they're buying catfish. So we've come to a point where we don't produce enough fish for export. We don't produce enough fish for local sales. So we now have to import fish. Why? Probably because we've killed out the fish population with gill nets.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to save our fish population, it's possible to bring them back if we completely ban gill nets. Partial banning and the laws that we have now are nice, but basically unenforceable.
The good thing about fisheries and excuse me, and fish stocks is they're extremely resilient. They have the ability to bounce back if the right conditions are put into place. If you look at places like Florida and Texas, Florida is probably one of or they consider themselves, they brand themselves, I'm not going to say they are, but they're certainly one of the sports fishing capitals of the world. Their sports fishing industry is worth billions of dollars. Just in the early 90s, I think it was in 1994, 1996, Florida was at a position where they said the snook population of this country, or of this state, sorry, is almost extinct. We almost consider now snook to be an extinct species in Florida waters. Texas also underwent the same thing with certain species of fish where they're no longer there. Sea trout was one of them specifically. Texas put a ban on gill nets in 1988. Now, to put it in context, I was born in 1989, so that's about 30 years ago. Florida put their gill net ban sometime in the early 90s. I was reading the sports fishing magazine over the weekend, one of the big U.S. sports fishing magazines. Belize is on there, every single issue, for the likelihood or one of the best places to catch fish, and as always, tarpon, bonefish, permit, and snook were always in there as one of the best places. Now, Florida, for a place that had considered the snook almost extinct in their waters, was number one for best places in the world to go and catch snook for the month of July. Now that goes to show that it's not going to happen overnight. If stricter regulations are placed on gill nets, it doesn't mean that tomorrow you can go out and there's going to be an abundance of fish like there used to be. It takes a long time, but it shows that if the right environment is put into place, it can, excuse me, it can improve.
Now, I suppose the greatest opponent here can very easily say a reduction in fish stock can be attributed to many things. It can be overfishing, it can be gill nets, but it could also be climate change. It could be development. You know, we have a problem with runoff from the agricultural sector as well. So there can be many issues. And the biggest concern is robbing any individual of their source of livelihood. We know from conversations with Oceana Belize where they've spoken of wanting to implement alternatives to fishermen who are using gill nets. What's been the uptake in that, and your individual thoughts as well as to whether or not a traditional fisherman can or wants to move away from what essentially works for them?
Well, at the lodge we have sport fishing guides. They can specialize in fly fishing or just general sport fishing. We have a couple of former commercial fishermen who are now top fishing guides. In fact, one has been with us almost 30 years. He's still a commercial fisherman, so when he's not working as a fishing guide, he goes after commercial fish. But he specialized in deep sea snapper fishing. I think he's given up on the shallow water fishing for commercial fishing over the years, and he's seen the changes. There's also a proposal that we can assist, or some way that can work out some assistance for the children of net fishermen who may lose their jobs as net fishermen by offering scholarships to their children. That is a long, drawn-out process, but it's a possibility. Alternative livelihood training can be trained for fishing guides. Not all commercial fishermen can be guides because communication is an important factor. But many of them can still do it. Or they can work in the sport fishing industry or other industries with proper training. So no matter what your present occupation is, if you desire to go into another field, in Belize there's some good training opportunities available, and we should try to make some more available, especially to those people.
And you certainly have to understand the commercial fisherman's point of view. This is your livelihood. It would be like tomorrow somebody comes and says, Marlene, no more news for you. You can't, you're not going to be in media anymore. You need to go and do something else. So it's important that their point of view be taken into consideration. It's not that we're saying nobody can be commercial fishermen. If there is a change, it just needs to be, people still need to be commercial fishermen. We just need to be doing it in the right way. And it might mean too that because we've depleted these fish stocks, not every fisherman's child or children, plural, because it could be 5, 6, 7 kids, can go into the fishing industry. We need to create an environment where education is key, and the children who want to be involved in fishing, maybe 1, maybe 2, can be, but not everybody can be involved in fishing. And we need to make sure that the alternative livelihoods are available. In my opinion, I think you can't just tell somebody who's been fishing for 30 years, an example Mr. Mike used, that you're going to have to change tomorrow. In my opinion, I think you need to be looking at the next generation and seeing how you can make sure that they're put on a platform where they can move into a different livelihood.
Now, as a member of the task force, many would assume that perhaps it's being put together only to validate the point of view of a ban on the gill net. Tell us what the work has been so far and what type of inclusion for those who oppose the ban has been accommodated for.
So there's the The task force was only just put together. The first meeting took place recently, so the work is only just beginning. They've done an excellent job of including as many people as possible. Of course, not everybody can be included. We can't have a conversation where there's 1,000 people all saying their own thing at the same time. They've done a good job at trying to determine who the main spokespersons are for the various industries. Those include tourism, they include recreational sports fishing. And when you say recreational sports fishing, you have to remember that there's the folks that Mr. Mike's lodge will take out, the foreigners who come in. So that's a balance between tourism and sports fishing, as well as the local fishermen, people like myself who go fishing for recreation. And we are Belizean. We're part of this is part of what we are about. There's the regulation, so fisheries is very much involved. Commercial fishermen are involved. So they're doing a very good job at getting all voices to the table, getting everybody's opinion. So we can try to figure out, what are the issues, and more than what the issues are, let's look at the data.
Yeah.
Because we can say colloquially all these different things as much as we want, but if there's no proof, if we don't have anything to substantiate it, then it's really just a bunch of talk. So we're trying to look at the data, and we're trying to come to what we believe is the right decision to make. Not necessarily because somebody is emotional and we're driving in that direction, or because most people are saying, the loudest voices are saying one thing, that's the way we're going. It's trying to make sure that it's on an all-inclusive process.
There's a prevailing opinion in some corners that while there has been a ban placed on bottom trawling, for instance, this direction that we're moving in to try to do away with gill netting is another step in terms of trying to take away what these fisher folk have been doing for generations traditionally. The argument being that there has not been a viable alternative. There has not been an option that they see would help them to be able to continue doing what they're doing as seagoers, as people who make a living from it. I think one of the points that was raised, you no longer want us to do this kind of fishing activity. Fine. Help us to transition into tourism, because that also has to do with the idea of enjoying the resource for what it is. But they've been struggling in terms of getting the proper people to assist with that kind of a transition. Does the task force look at this, or do you have any, how do I say, is there any part of your mandate that looks at folks who want to transition from fishing, from gill net fishing specifically, to any other area, perhaps tourism or any other form of livelihood?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the task force is made up of quite a few people from the tourism industry, the NGO community, so research. So, I know there's various organizations around this country who have taken people, say a shark fisherman. Now, a shark fisherman is the man who knows where the sharks live. He knows what they do, he knows what they eat, he knows how they operate. In the back of his head, not knowing it, he is a scientist already. He understands how he's monitored these creatures for many, many years, so he knows a lot about them, just that perhaps he wasn't given the educational platform to put that forward. So there are quite a few NGOs around the country who have taken shark fishermen, who have taken gill net fishermen, who have taken all sorts of fishermen and put them into a job role and say, right, you're going to do what you've been doing for decades, you're just going to do it in a different application. So now, instead of killing the sharks, we're going to go and catch them, we're going to tag them, we're going to study their movements, we're going to monitor them, and we're going to see how they reproduce and how they benefit the economy. And sometimes, in most cases, those people are the ones who are the most effective because they have the experience. And in truth, they love these things. They might have supported them in one way by killing them and taking them to the market 10 years ago. And today they're still paying my bills because I'm able to study them and I'm able to produce for my family. And that's just a single example. The examples extend across the board into tourism, into fly fishing, and into commercial fishing. And again, I say that it's not that people are saying we have to stop commercial fishing. It's important and it has to be done. It's just that we need to make sure that the base of fish is there. to support
Yeah.
support
The
it. And
sustainability.
and because there are so many people involved in the GillNet task force, there will be recommendations for alternative livelihoods put forward and how we can make sure we move these things forward.
So to be clear, the task force does not have a definitive position as to what they want to put forward as yet.
No.
So it's not that you're moving towards a ban. Some are recommending it. It may be just to get the resources to enforce the regulations that are currently in place.
Exactly. There's no option. There's no single option that has been laid out yet.
And just to clearly understand, is it a matter of resources as to why we're not enforcing what seem to be very good regulations that have been put in place for gill nets?
Resources is the common explanation from
Yeah.
State Fisheries Department. We have often called the Fisheries Department to report illegal netting. You know, that we know these nets are not supposed to be there. But most of these nets are set out after 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Fisheries is not working at that time,
Yeah.
usually.
Yeah.
Once in a while they will. We once asked if we could help with the resources for patrolling or for going after specific situations. And Fisheries came up with a number which I hesitate to say, well, what it would cost for gasoline per month. And if that is what it costs them to do their patrolling and so on, I understand why they can't do it. Fisheries is a very important department in Belize, from the commercial as well as sport fishing department. Well, they don't get involved with sport fishing usually, but and I think they're grossly underfunded from the government of Belize. And every department can probably claim that as well. But because of the resources that we're using, the natural resources, the fisheries from the sea and so on, I think fisheries should be much better supported by the government. But that's probably more political than we need to get into. The other aspect of gill nets, alternatives for fishermen. Gill nets are actually depleting the fish stock, and yes, there may be some other factors as well, but we can see it. We can see it up front. We see fish kills from time to time. That may be chemicals or sargassum or something like that.
Yeah.
But the pictures you've seen here with different animals in the gill nets are actually depleting the fish's stock for the gill net fishermen. They will be eliminating their job on their own after a time. So if nothing is done, they will lose out on their resource. They will lose out on the amount of fish available for them to catch to make their living, and they'll be forced to go into something else, and many have already done so. The other factor and enforcement is foreign net fishermen that come into Belize. And I'm not going to get into the political aspects of the SARS tuna and so.
But we've had video images of
But you know, some of the southern fishermen, Monkey River and Placentia area, told the minister a few years ago, we were willing to give up our gill nets if you can stop the Guatemalans and the Honduranians from coming in with their gill nets. And so far, no progress.
So the task force, as you mentioned, is made up of NGOs and people from different sectors. And what's the involvement of the Fisheries Department?
The Fisheries Department is also on the task force as well. They have a seat on the task force, so they're a very valid opinion. They're the ones who are charged with the enforcements. If there are issues with resource allocation, they're the ones who can speak to it. Nobody else can really say to it.
So Oceana Belize has issued a press release speaking of transparency in the issue, making a request directly to the Fisheries Department for full disclosure on fishermen who are using the nets and what data they have available. How does this fit into the task force if there's a need for information for a member from the task force that hasn't been provided as yet?
I mean, data is key.
Yeah.
Like I said, we can talk about it all we want, but unless we see the actual numbers, we don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Oceana, I'm aware of their press release, which is good. I think all Belizeans should be entitled to know who. This is a shared resource.
Yeah.
This isn't something for Andrew to use and Isani can't go use it. This is something that everybody should be entitled to. So the information should be made readily available. Who's using it, how much they're using, when they're using, and what they're paying to use it. So it is a good call for information. I think
there's a counterpoint though. It being, from what I have been told, requesting information on who the licensed gill netters are and where they go to do their fishing activity and what have you, is tantamount to saying, well, look, I'll go to the traffic department and ask for someone's information for their driver's license and what have you. The argument being that, well, if you're using it for regulation purposes, then fine. But then Oceana isn't a regulatory body. So what need would they have for someone's personal information in that regard? That's the counterpoint that I have been
understood.
told.
Yeah, and I can see. I mean, fishermen, even in the sports fishing industry, we have a hard time getting the sports fishermen to say when we're trying to do data collection, I caught this fish and I caught it at this location at this time of day, so that we have data on it. Now, people always come back and say, well, you're going to take my information and you're going to sell it off to somebody else who can go use it for their own use. I mean, we can sit here and come up with conspiracy theories all day, but you know, using a comparison, if you go fishing, if you get on the road, you have to have your license sticker and your insurance sticker displayed. If you go to the traffic department, you can find out how many licensed vehicles there are on the road. That information is readily available. Now, it's not saying that you're going to find out that Isani uses his car to go buy fried chicken at Lychee at 12 o'clock in the afternoon and that kind of thing. It's just saying we want the data made available to know that we can quantify what number of people are using these resources.
So just my final question, is there a timeline in place as to when you have to make a final recommendation as a task force?
No, there's no timeline. I think this is a process that I think is going to have to create its own timeline. There's a lot of information to look at. There's a lot of sides to the story that have to be heard. I think every fisherman deserves the opportunity to put their case forward and say, this is why I think you should keep gill nets. This is why I think you should ban gill nets. This is why I think you should increase the regulation or the enforcement or what have you. But it's going to be one that's going to draw out its own timeline.
All right. Well, thank you for coming in to expand the conversation this morning.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of the Belize City Council. So stay tuned.